The clock had no second hand, or maybe it did, and I had simply stopped trusting it. A thin glass face, faintly fogged at the edges, hung on a nail that never sat straight. It leaned the way everything leaned in that room, just enough to look accidental, just enough to feel like a decision no one wanted to admit to making. When the minute tick finally came, it wasn't a click, so much as a small, private surrender. The kind of sound you only hear when you're listening too hard. Someone behind me cleared his throat quietly, as if even a throat could betray you. The chair legs shifted, wood against wood. A careful scrape stopped halfway through. A hand reached for a tin cup, then hesitated, then reached again with the patience of someone rehearsing how to look normal. There were papers on the table, stacked and restacked until the corners began to soften. Each time a page moved, it made the same dry hiss, the same complaint. I watched a thumb smooth a crease out of the top sheet, again and again, like it could press uncertainty flat. The paper did not become easier to read. It only became warmer where the skin touched it. A lamp burned in the middle of the table, its shade stained with old smoke. The light pooled downward, refusing to spread. Everything beyond that circle stayed in its own dim agreement. Outlines of cabinets, a hanging coat, a closed door with paint chipped at the latch. Even the shadows looked organized, kept in their places by habit. Somewhere farther down the corridor, water moved through a pipe with a soft rushing sigh, then stopped. A switch clicked. A distant heel tapped twice, then nothing. The building seemed to inhale and hold it, as if it knew what would follow the exhale. A pencil rolled a few inches across the tabletop and came to rest against the rim of an inkwell. Nobody reached for it. The smallest things were allowed to settle. That was the rule of waiting. Let objects finish their journeys. Let them stop where they stop. Don't interfere. Don't tempt the world to notice you. The man nearest the wall checked his wristwatch, then checked it again, as if the first glance had been a mistake. He didn't say the time, nobody asked. Time was not something you shared anymore. It was something you guarded, like a secret, like a weakness. A folder lay half open, its string untied, the knot left loose as though someone had meant to return to it. The flap lifted slightly when the room shifted, a faint flutter, a suggestion of breath. I stared at it too long and imagined it closing on its own, slow and final, a mouth shutting. From outside, if outside still meant anything, came a low, steady sound, not quite a hum, not quite wind. It rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost soothing, the way repetition can trick the brain into believing there's safety in pattern. Every so often it was interrupted by something sharper, a metallic knock, a brief clatter, a voice that started and then cut off like a line pulled taut. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said might turn into something real. I watched a man trace the edge of a blotter with his finger, circling the same rectangle as if he could fence in what was coming. His nail caught on a rough spot, and he frowned at it, annoyed, then smoothed it down with the care of someone correcting a minor fault in a world full of larger ones. A pen cap came off, went back on, came off again. That small sound, plastic or metal, a soft snap, was the only thing that resembled a decision. The cap was set on the table. Then, almost immediately, it was picked up again and held between two fingers like a cigarette you weren't allowed to light. The closed door did not move. We had all become experts at listening to nothing happen. The lamp's flame, or filament, made a tiny invisible tremor in the air above it. Heat shimmered. Dust drifted lazily through the light and vanished when it fell into shadow. I followed one speck until it disappeared and felt, absurdly, that it had gone somewhere important. The minutes continued to fall one by one, each one landing without ceremony. Then from behind the door, a sound that wasn't footsteps, not exactly, more like the soft weight of someone leaning close, as if to test whether the room was awake. Nobody moved. The clock surrendered another minute, and in the silence that followed, it became impossible to pretend we still had time to spare. The first thing you learned, living inside the war, was how to keep your hands busy. Not because there was work that needed doing. There was always too much of that. Always something half-finished, always a stack of messages that could never be fully answered. But because stillness made room for thoughts. And thoughts, left unattended, had a way of growing teeth. So the hands found their rituals. A matchbox slid from one palm to the other and back again without ever opening. A cuff got straightened, then straightened once more, though the fabric had been pressed into obedience hours ago. A button was checked at the throat, tugged, and released. In the lamplight, those small motions looked almost tender, like men caring for themselves before stepping out into daylight, except there was no daylight waiting, only another room, another corridor, another closed door. Someone at the far end of the table reached for the same pencil that had rolled earlier and began to sharpen it with a small pocket knife. The blade scraped wood in thin curls that fell like pale shavings onto the blotter. He did it slowly, not to make the point better, but to extend the act. When the pencil was perfect, he didn't write. He set it down as if it might explode if pressed to paper. Across from him, a man unfolded a map that did not need unfolding. It had already been opened so many times the creases were soft, almost worn through. He ran his fingertips along the folds and paused at the intersections where the paper threatened to tear. He didn't point to anything specific. He simply smoothed it, as though geography itself could be calmed. In the corridor outside, the building continued its quiet routine. A kettle somewhere hissed in a brief, hopeful way. A drawer slid shut. A murmur of voices rose and settled again, not arguing, not laughing, just the low, tired current of people speaking because they were still alive, and language was one of the few things that hadn't been rationed. The closed door remained closed. On the table, the papers waited under a paperweight that looked out of place, something polished and heavy, shaped like a blunt riverstone. It held the top page down as though the document might try to lift itself and flee. There were stamps visible near the bottom, ink dark and official, their edges slightly blurred by hurried hands. The text above them was mostly hidden under another sheet, but just enough lines showed to make your eyes want to complete them. You didn't. You learned not to complete what you couldn't stop. A chair shifted. A man cleared his throat again, softer this time, as if he'd been corrected by the room. Another man, older by posture if not by face, leaned forward and stared at the lampshade, at the stains on it, at the uneven ring of smoke as if it contained a message. He looked like someone listening for a train that might never arrive. Outside, the war continued on its own schedule. Somewhere beyond the walls, engines idled, not roaring, not charging, just waiting like animals held at the leash. You could feel their vibration faintly through the floorboards if you sat still long enough. The sound was steady, patient, almost polite. That was what made it worse. If it had been frantic, you could have called it fear. But this was something else. This was readiness. The man with the wristwatch checked it again. This time he turned his arm slightly so the face wouldn't catch the light. A private glance. His lips moved without sound, counting or praying or both. When he lowered his arm, his hand stayed curled for a moment, as though it had forgotten how to open. On the wall near the door, a calendar hung with dates crossed out in thick pencil strokes. The current day was circled twice, like an accusation. Under the calendar, a small hook held an empty place where a coat should have been. The emptiness looked deliberate. Someone spoke at last, and the words were ordinary enough to be cruel. "Tea?" he asked. It wasn't offered from kindness. It was offered from instinct. The body, starving for any familiar shape of life, reached for the old comforts like a blind man reaching for a railing. Tea meant you were still in the part of the day where tea made sense. Tea meant there would be cups to wash later. Tea meant you could swallow something warm and tell yourself the world had not yet tilted. A few heads turned, slow and cautious, like animals reacting to a twig snap. No one answered immediately. Then a quiet, almost embarrassed chorus. "Yes, if there's any." "Please." Someone stood to fetch it, grateful for the excuse to move. His chair legs protested. He paused, listening as if the chair might have said too much, then continued. When he left, the room fell into an even deeper silence, as though his departure had taken the last safe sound with it. I watched the map man fold the paper again, carefully aligning crease with crease. He did it with the seriousness of a surgeon closing a wound. When the map was folded, he tapped its edge twice on the table, squaring it. He set it beside the paperweight and did not look at it again. A draft touched the lamp flame and made it tremble. The light wavered, and for an instant the faces around the table looked different, hollower, older, as if the flicker had revealed what they'd been hiding from themselves. Then the light steadied, and everyone returned to their practiced expressions. Calm, attentive, functional. The corridor offered another small sound. Footsteps approaching, measured, not hurried. The kind of walk someone takes when they know they must arrive, but also know arriving will change everything. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door. No knock, no announcement. Just a pause long enough for everyone in the room to stop breathing at the same moment. Then, from somewhere outside and low, almost lost beneath the building's quiet life, came a distant, sustained note. Not a siren, not yet. More like a signal. Something tested and held, as though someone had pressed a key and kept it down, waiting to see who would respond. One man smiled faintly, as if to pretend it was nothing. Another man reached for his cup, though it wasn't there. And the clock, faithful and indifferent, dropped another minute into the room like a coin into deep water. It started with things that were easy to explain away. A pause in the corridor that lasted half a breath too long. A voice that carried a fraction of strain beneath its practiced steadiness. The kind of strain you only notice if you already know how to listen for it. Someone laughed, softly, reflexively, at a remark that hadn't been meant as a joke. The sound landed wrong and was never answered. The tea arrived. Cups were set down carefully, one by one, porcelain touching wood with muted taps. Steam rose and curled into the lamplight, briefly softening the edges of the room. The smell was familiar, almost comforting, and for a moment it worked. Hands wrapped around warmth, shoulders eased. Someone exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, like a man reminding himself how to breathe. The kettle was taken away. The door closed again. Normality reasserted itself with stubborn patience. A man near the end of the table blew gently across the surface of his tea, watching the ripples spread and fade. He did it twice, 3 times, until the liquid stilled. Only then did he drink. Another man stirred sugar into his cup, though he never took a sip. The spoon clinked once, then stopped. The spoon stayed in the cup, leaning at an angle, forgotten. A messenger passed the open doorway beyond the closed one. Boots visible for an instant, moving left to right, then gone. No one reacted. Messengers passed all the time. That was their purpose, to move so others didn't have to. The low sound outside, the one that had held its note earlier, returned. But this time it wavered. It dipped, then steadied again, like someone adjusting their grip. The vibration under the floor grew just slightly more noticeable. Not enough to demand attention. Enough to be felt if you were already sitting still. Someone mentioned the weather. It was said casually, with a trace of complaint, as if the day had simply turned inconvenient. Heads nodded. A comment followed about the cold, or the damp, or the way conditions made everything take longer than it should. It was a safe subject. The war allowed that much. The right to complain about elements you could not control. A chair scraped as a man leaned back, stretching his shoulders. The sound seemed too loud, and he winced, glancing toward the door. When nothing followed, he relaxed again, embarrassed at himself. The calendar on the wall fluttered slightly, stirred by a draft that hadn't been there before. One corner lifted and fell, tapping softly against the plaster. No one reached to still it. The repetition was oddly soothing, like a heartbeat. The man with the wristwatch checked it again. This time he frowned, not sharply, just enough to crease the skin between his brows. He turned his wrist, tilted the watch toward the lamp, then away, as if the light itself might be distorting the truth. After a moment, he adjusted the strap and settled his arm back on the table. The frown smoothed itself out. Whatever he'd noticed, he decided it could wait. A file near the center of the table had been opened at some point without anyone remembering when. Its contents lay exposed, typed pages, carbon copies, signatures stacked one beneath another. A corner of one page trembled slightly, stirred by air or by nerves. It was hard to tell which. A hand hovered over it, then withdrew, leaving the page exactly where it was. In the distance, something metallic clanged and echoed, followed by a sharp, shouted word that cut off abruptly. The echo lingered longer than the sound that made it. Someone in the room tilted his head, listening. "Just maintenance," another said too quickly. The listener nodded, relieved to be given an explanation that required no further thought. Minutes passed, or seconds stretched until they resembled minutes. Time had begun to behave strangely, looping back on itself, refusing to move forward in a straight line. The clock marked it faithfully, but the body disagreed. The body felt suspended, as if held just above the ground. A man reached for his pen at last and wrote a single word in the margin of a document. He stared at it, then drew a line through it. The ink bled slightly into the paper fibers, leaving a faint shadow of what had almost been committed. He closed the folder carefully and tied the string. Another messenger crossed the corridor outside, this one moving faster. Boots struck the floor with more urgency than before. Still, no knock came at the door. Someone joked about delays. It was said with a practiced shrug, the kind of humor built from long familiarity with waiting. Delays meant orders hadn't arrived yet. Delays meant someone somewhere was still deciding. Delays meant nothing had been set in motion beyond recall. Laughter followed, thin but genuine. It felt good to laugh. It made the room lighter for a few seconds. Then the laughter faded and no one tried to replace it. The vibration beneath the floor deepened, just a touch. Cups trembled imperceptibly on their saucers. A ripple crossed the surface of the tea left untouched. The man who noticed it assumed his hand had moved. He didn't mention it. From outside came a brief burst of static, then silence. Someone muttered about the equipment. Another nodded. Equipment always misbehaved. It was one of the few constants left. The door remained closed. The lamp continued to burn. The clock surrendered another minute, and with each small dismissal, each ordinary explanation accepted without question, the room quietly taught itself how to ignore what it already knew. Time began to behave as if it had discovered weight. Not heavy enough to crush, not yet, but enough to press. Enough to make each movement feel deliberate, as though every action had to push through a thin resistance in the air. The door finally opened. Not wide, not dramatically. Just enough to break the room's sealed quiet. The hinge made a sound that was almost apologetic. A man stepped in, paused with one hand still on the handle, and let his eyes adjust. He didn't look surprised by what he saw. That alone unsettled something in the room. No one stood. No one spoke. He closed the door behind him carefully, as if noise itself had become a liability. The latch clicked into place, final but ordinary, the kind of sound you'd heard 1,000 times and never remembered. Now it felt louder than it should have. He carried nothing in his hands. That, too, was noticed. He moved to the table and rested his palms on the edge, leaning forward slightly. Not in authority, not in command, in posture only. A man anchoring himself to something solid while the ground shifted underfoot. His sleeves were rolled just past the wrist. A faint mark circled one arm where a watch had been removed recently, pale against darker skin. "Still time," someone said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an argument. It was an offering. The man nodded once. A shallow movement, ambiguous enough to be accepted by everyone who needed it to mean yes. The clock ticked. Another paper was pulled free from the stack, smoothed, aligned. Someone slid it across the table toward the man who had just entered. He didn't touch it immediately. His eyes traced the margin, the stamps, the space where a signature would eventually live. Eventually was doing a lot of work. A voice from the corner mentioned a confirmation that hadn't come through yet. The words were neutral, professional. There was no accusation in them. Just information, delivered as if information alone could still shape the outcome. The man nodded again. "Let's wait," he said. No one argued. Waiting had become a skill by then, a discipline. You learned how to sit without fidgeting, how to listen without reacting, how to keep your face arranged in something that resembled patience. You learned how to keep your thoughts from outrunning your body. Outside, the engines changed their rhythm. Not louder, just different. A subtle adjustment, like breath drawn deeper into the chest. The vibration beneath the floor sharpened, resolving into something more purposeful. The man nearest the wall shifted his feet unconsciously, as if to regain balance. Someone glanced toward the ceiling, then looked away. A message was brought in without ceremony, passed through the door by a hand that never revealed its owner. It was folded once, tightly. The man at the table took it, opened it, read it in silence. His expression didn't change. When he finished, he folded it again exactly the same way and set it beside the lamp. "What does it say?" someone asked. "Nothing new," he replied. That answer traveled easily through the room. It settled into people's shoulders, loosened jaws. Nothing new meant nothing worse. Nothing new meant the situation was stable, even if stability was an illusion everyone shared. The paperweight was moved an inch to the left. It was a meaningless action. That was why it mattered. When the mind reached for control, it took it where it could. A pen was uncapped again. This time it stayed uncapped. It hovered above the page, close enough for ink to fall if the hand shook. It didn't. Outside, a signal repeated, shorter now, more frequent. Someone muttered about schedules. Someone else mentioned a window. The word hung there for a moment, thin and fragile. A window suggested choice. It suggested that if you acted correctly, quickly enough, something could still be altered. No one defined what the window was. No one asked how long it stayed open. The man with the pen lowered it, gently, and set it parallel to the paper's edge. Alignment mattered. It gave the impression of readiness without commitment. The tea had gone cold. A cup was lifted, tested, set back down untouched. Steam no longer rose. The room smelled faintly of metal now, or oil, or perhaps that was imagination filling the gaps left by silence. The calendar fluttered again, then stilled on its own. From beyond the walls came movement, organized, directional, orders not yet spoken but already understood, the kind of motion that didn't wait for permission because it had been rehearsed too many times to stop now. Inside the room, a man inhaled sharply as if to speak. He exhaled instead. The clock surrendered another minute. And in that minute, thin, narrowing, almost gone, the room existed in its last true state of possibility, even as everyone inside behaved as though the choice had already been made. It happened without ceremony. No raised voices, no sudden movement, no signal anyone could point to later and say, that was it. If you weren't watching closely, if you were listening only for something dramatic, you would have missed it entirely. The man at the table reached forward and drew the folded message closer to him. Just an inch, maybe less. The paper made the faintest sound as it slid across the wood, a soft drag like skin against cloth. It stopped beside the stack of documents, aligned with their edges. Neat, intentional. The kind of placement that suggested the paper belonged there now, even if it hadn't a moment before. No one commented. Someone cleared his throat, then thought better of it. Outside, the engine settled into a steady cadence, no longer adjusting, no longer searching. The vibration beneath the floor became uniform, predictable in a way that felt final. It was no longer the sound of waiting. It was the sound of readiness that no longer needed reassurance. A hand reached for the paperweight again. This time, it was lifted. The object felt heavier than it looked. Polished stone, cool and smooth, shaped by a river that had stopped caring about resistance long before any of them were born. The man holding it hesitated, just briefly, as if some instinct still understood the weight of putting it down somewhere new. Then he placed it on top of the documents. The pages flattened, corners stilled. The faint flutter ceased. Something closed, not physically, not completely, but enough to feel it. The pen was picked up, still no writing. Just the pen in the hand, balanced between fingers that no longer trembled. The cap lay where it had been set earlier, open end facing the lamp like a small dark eye. Ink waited patiently in its narrow chamber, indifferent to hesitation. "Proceeding," someone said. The word wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It didn't sound like an instruction, more like an observation, a way of acknowledging movement without claiming responsibility for it. No one contradicted him. A chair creaked as a man shifted forward, then settled back again. Another adjusted his collar, tugging once, sharply, as if the air had grown tighter around his neck. The man with the wristwatch checked it again, not out of anxiety now, but habit. The numbers made sense again. Time had fallen back into line. From the corridor came footsteps, many of them now, moving with purpose, no longer cautious. Doors opened and closed farther away. Voices overlapped briefly, then separated into distinct paths. Whatever uncertainty had lived in those halls earlier had thinned, drained away by repetition. The man who had entered earlier, the one with no papers, no insignia in his hands, straightened. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His posture alone suggested the shift. Waiting had ended. What followed no longer required discussion. A cup tipped slightly as someone moved his arm. Tea spilled onto the table, spreading in a shallow stain. It soaked into the wood quickly, darkening it. No one reached for a cloth. The spill was allowed to complete itself. The calendar on the wall stopped fluttering altogether. The air felt different now, denser, as though the room had been sealed not to keep something out but to keep something in. Breaths became quieter, more economical. Even blinking felt deliberate. The pen touched the paper. Not to sign. Not yet. Just to make a small mark near the margin. A dot, perhaps, or a line so short it could barely be called a line. The kind of mark you might make absent-mindedly while thinking. The kind no one would notice later unless they were searching for proof that a moment had existed at all. The pen lifted. The mark remained. Outside, a distant signal changed tone. Not louder, not urgent, simply different. The engines responded in kind, their rhythm shifting as one. A synchronized adjustment, rehearsed, precise. Inside the room, no one moved to stop anything. No one asked another question. No one suggested waiting a little longer. The clock surrendered another minute, and this time, when it did, the sound felt less like a surrender and more like confirmation, as if something unseen had crossed a line so quietly that only time itself had noticed. The room learned a new kind of quiet. Not the careful silence from before, filled with listening and restraint, but a heavier stillness that followed alignment. The kind that settles after a decision has already traveled outward, after the machinery no longer waits for voices to agree. No one spoke. No one needed to. The lamp continued to burn, its light unchanged, indifferent to the shift it illuminated. Shadows held their places. Dust drifted and vanished. The stain from the spilled tea had stopped spreading, its edge defined now, a dark shape that would dry exactly as it was. Breathing slowed, not from calm, but from economy. Each inhale seemed measured, each exhale controlled, as though the air itself had become limited. A man near the wall held his breath without realizing it, then released it carefully through his nose, afraid of the sound it might make. Outside, movement synchronized. Boots struck ground in even intervals. Doors opened and closed with practiced timing. Somewhere far beyond the walls, something large shifted its weight and settled into position. The vibration beneath the floor was no longer something you noticed. It was something you were inside of. Like a current you stopped resisting because resistance no longer mattered. Inside the room, hands rested flat on the table. No more fidgeting, no more rituals. Objects stayed where they were placed. The pen lay parallel to the paper. The paper lay flat beneath the stone. The folded message remained unopened, unread again, finished with its work. The man with the wristwatch did not look at it. He already knew what it would say. The calendar stayed perfectly still, the circled date staring outward like an unblinking eye. The empty hook beneath it looked less temporary now, less like something waiting to be filled, just empty, complete in its emptiness. A sound traveled through the walls, not sharp, not alarming, or like pressure equalizing, the kind of noise that suggested systems engaging, processes sliding into place. It lasted only a moment, but its absence afterward felt deliberate. Someone swallowed. Another blinked slowly, once, as if committing the room to memory without knowing why. The lampshade's smoke stains looked darker at the edges now, or perhaps the eye had simply learned where to look. The man who had leaned on the table earlier straightened fully. He didn't gather anything. He didn't signal. He simply stood as someone stands when their part is finished, when remaining seated would feel dishonest. The door was still closed. That was what mattered most. No interruption came, no last-minute correction, no voice from the corridor demanding reconsideration. The war did not knock. It did not announce itself. It moved according to what had already been set in motion, and what had been set in motion no longer required permission. A distant sound, too far to identify clearly, rose, held, then cut off. Not an alarm, not yet. Just a test, perhaps, or confirmation. Inside, the room did nothing in response. A man reached up and rubbed his eyes briefly. the heel of his hand pressing into one socket, then the other. When he lowered his hand, his gaze was steady. Whatever he had seen behind his eyes, he did not share. The tea had gone completely cold now. The smell had faded. The room smelled like paper and oil and old wood, like a place that would outlast the people inside it, like a place that would remember without understanding. The clock ticked. This time the sound did not feel like loss. It felt like a boundary. Another minute gathered itself, full and intact, and waited just beyond the present, ready to fall. No one moved to stop it. No one reached for the door. No one spoke the word that might have broken the spell, even if breaking it no longer mattered. The lamp burned. The room held its breath. And time, perfectly balanced on its edge, refused to move forward, just long enough to make the waiting eternal. Nothing arrived. That was the strangest part of it. The way the world paused without explanation, as if even consequence had learned to hesitate. The room remained sealed in its careful arrangement. The lamp's glow did not flicker. The shadows did not creep. The objects on the table held their positions with the stubborn loyalty of things that had already been assigned meaning and would not let it go. Breath moved quietly from chest to chest. Not synchronized, not deliberate, just present. Proof that time was still technically alive. Outside, the cadence continued, not rushing, not accelerating, simply continuing, step after step, rotation after rotation. A mechanism no longer asking whether it should proceed, only ensuring that it did so correctly. The sound traveled through walls and bone alike, low enough to be felt rather than heard, a pressure more than a noise. Inside the room, eyes adjusted, details sharpened, the grain of the wood, a faint scratch near the table's edge that no one remembered making. The uneven wax drip hardened at the base of the lamp. These small things became anchors, places for the mind to rest because the larger picture had grown too vast to hold all at once. A man's fingers twitched, then stilled. Another shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, a movement so small it barely disturbed the air. The body remembering that it still existed, even as it waited to be overtaken by something larger. The folded message did not move. It had already said everything it needed to say. The pen lay untouched. The ink inside it waited without impatience, dark and ready, but unnecessary now. Words had finished their work. Language had carried things as far as it could. Beyond the walls, something vast aligned itself, not violently, not dramatically, with the calm certainty of a process long rehearsed. A final check, a silent acknowledgement passed from one unseen hand to another, the kind of exchange that required no witness because it trusted itself. Inside, the door remained closed. That mattered. Because as long as the door stayed shut, the room could pretend it was separate, that what happened beyond it belonged to a different reality, governed by different rules, that if no one crossed the threshold, then nothing had truly arrived yet. The clock ticked again. The sound was softer now, or perhaps the ears had grown tired of resisting it. Each tick landed gently, like a footstep placed with care on fragile ground. Time, too, seemed to be testing how much weight the moment could bear. A man blinked, slowly, deliberately, as if he were afraid that when his eyes opened again, the world would have changed without consulting him. When they opened, everything was still the same. The room had learned how to exist in that narrow space between before and after, a place where the future pressed close enough to be felt, but not yet close enough to be seen, where the past no longer offered guidance, and the present refused to move. Outside, the sound shifted once more, not louder, not closer, just resolved, as if whatever had been waiting for a final alignment had found it. Inside, no one reacted. There was nothing left to react to. The air felt held, suspended like breath caught at the top of the lungs. Even the dust seemed to hesitate, hanging in the lamplight instead of falling. The calendar did not move. The empty hook remained empty. The tea stain stayed dark and unfinished. The man who had stood earlier remained standing. He did not look at the door. He did not look at the others. His gaze rested somewhere indeterminate, focused not on a thing, but on a moment that had stretched too thin to be trusted. Outside, a signal was prepared, not sent, prepared. Inside, The room waited, not for permission, not for confirmation, but for the simple act of time resuming its ordinary function. The clock leaned slightly on its nail. The lamp burned. Breath moved in and out, quiet and careful. And the moment just before everything changed held on, perfectly still, perfectly balanced, refusing for one final breath to become the past.